Good day, everyone. I was at a bookstore yesterday and I was looking through an anthology of great American short stories. And something I've been doing over the years is I look through these books whenever I find them, just out of curiosity as to who's there, who's not. But I tend to look for one writer to see if he's in there. And yesterday's anthology, what I found were the usual suspects. You see Hawthorne, you see Poe, um, Cheever, Hemingway, Jackson. Um, every once in a while, you'll see Ambrose Bierce, and whenever I do see it, with a smile on my face, right? Maybe you might see Bradbury, maybe Harlan Ellison, but usually the science fiction writers are not included in these anthologies. But one writer I rarely ever see, and whenever I don't see his name, I usually don't get these books. Great American authors, great short story writers in the 20th century or since the founding of the country, whatever, right? Is I never see Paul Bowles in that list. At least it's extremely rare that I see anything by Bowles, which to me is very, very frustrating. I don't know why he's not included in of the best American short story writers, because I rank him up there with Henry James, and with Bierce and Poe and Nabokov. And I prefer them much more to Hemingway and all the usual suspects. He's a writer I often return to. But again, for some reason, he's rarely in any anthologies. Maybe when you go by and you decide you want to do what I do and go through, 20th century writers, at least if it's limited that way, and do you see him, any of his stories in there? I rarely do. So I didn't buy this anthology. I just left it there. There's no point in getting it. And a handful of videos that I've been making, I've only been discussing books, writers, stories that I like. And that's basically going to be what this channel is about whenever I do make a video. And today I'm going to discuss two writers and two stories, which are some of my favorite in the short story genre. And I'll begin with Paul Bowles. Bowles has been with me since the early 90s when I got a collection of short stories by him. It was a hardback edition of this one that you see here. And Bowles is just a fascinating man. I mean, he was an American, but he spent most of his time abroad in Mexico and Paris, and for most of his later life in Tangiers. So most of his stories are set abroad. Now, many of them tend to have Americans in them whenever they get in really interesting situations abroad, where they don't understand their environment, the civilizations that they're in, the cultures, etc. And his stories are extremely unsettling. And he's got a wonderful scientific prose when he writes. Now, he started out as a poet, but he met Gertrude Stein, and Stein told him, "You're not a poet." And so he left his poetry and became a composer. And his music, I have a cassette of some of his music somewhere around here. It's very much like Aaron Copland. And some of the early compositions, he worked with Tennessee Williams when Williams was starting out doing his plays like The Glass Menagerie. And eventually he started writing short stories. And one of the earliest that he wrote was, I think, in 1948, 1949, which is the story I'm going to discuss here, is Pages from Cold Point. The premise of the story is you have a professor of a university, American university, whose wife has died and left them quite a bit of money. They have one son, a 16-year-old son, named Racky. The professor's name is Norton. And now he's done. He doesn't like teaching at the university that he's in. He doesn't like his colleagues. He's out of here. And he's taking his son with him. And they're going to go to some island in the Caribbean and spend, I guess, the rest of their life there, I suppose. However, before he embarks on this, the story begins, his older brother comes to see him. And him and his brother don't have a good relationship. Something happened when they were growing up together, and Norton does not like his brother. But also his brother's there to tell him, I can't believe you have custody of this boy. And I can't believe you're taking him abroad with you after what you did. And now we're in Bo's territory. There's a lot of things in the surface in his short stories, but the undercurrents are left for you, the reader. What is happening here? Because Bowes is not going to explain it for you. Not at all. Norton basically dismisses his brother's concerns, basically ignores him. And the brother says, if there was a way legally, I can take this boy away from you. So Norton and his son, they go to this little island. They find a place away from the town. They have a pretty good relationship. The boy, again, is 16 years old. He likes to take his bike and ride into town. They have some servants that live with them and do the things that servants do, right? But at one point, a police officer shows up to talk with the father when the boy's not there. And when the police officer shows up, he says, that boy that's here, you say he's your son, but he's skeptical that it's his son. There's been talk in the town of some of the things your son is doing with the boys and with the men, and he's paying them. It's better if you keep him here, because these are country folk, for his own protection. When the son comes home, the father doesn't have a conversation with him about what has just transpired. Now, the story is told from the point of view of the father, first person narration. And it's interesting how he sees these facts taking place. And you as the reader, you do get into his mind, but just on the surface of it. The undercurrents, no. The abyss is left for you to discern. The son agrees. What the father does do when he tells the son, he says, why don't you stop going into town and just stay here? And one night, and this is the part in the story which is at the heart of this, and which is probably the most disturbing in the story, is the father goes to bed, and he sees the shape on the bed. The bed sheet has been spread over, and there's a naked form on the bed, on its side, and it's his son. The story continues afterwards, and it has an interesting ending. But it leaves you with the reader as to what exactly happened in this story. And it leaves you very, very rattled. There was a film made in the early 2000s, Ma Mireille, starring Isabelle Hubert, fantastic French actress, which is based on a Georges Bataille story about a mother who introduces her teenage son into her hedonistic lifestyle. And if you read Georges Bataille's novella or seen this film, it goes into areas that are pretty disturbing as to what the mother wants the son to do, not just with her, but with her friends. When it comes to Bowes, there really aren't other American writers like him. When I think about other writers, I think of Julio Cortázar from Argentina, and I think of Georges Bataille. And now these were all his contemporaries. Now I don't know if he read any of them, but I know that with Bowes, he was fluent in Spanish and other languages, and he did translate some Spanish short stories and other books from Mexican writers and other South and Central American writers. Now, I don't know if Julio Cortázar and him ever met, but when it comes to their storytelling, it's very similar. And even Bowes incorporates storylines where you have a boy who becomes a snake, takes the personality of a snake. Just like Julio Cortázar has a story of a man who takes the personality of a fish. What all three writers, Bataille, Cortázar, and him, have in common is the influence of surrealism, the elements of the fantastic. I've never liked that cutesy term of magic realism someone came up with a long time ago. I've never liked it. And these are basically writers who've been influenced again by the fantastic and surrealism, the surreal. So Bowes and this short story, and I've read most of his stories, and again they're very unsettling in a very wonderful way, in the sense of what he can do with his prose. And yet he's never mentioned in any of our anthologies, and I do not understand why. But I recommend him. Again, the story is Pages from Cold Point, and you can find it in this collection here, Collected Stories by Bowes. Now, the other writer I want to discuss is a writer I read before I read Bowes. And I read Bowes in the early 90s. But when I was 18 or 19, it was 18 or 19, I discovered the novels of D.H. Lawrence. It was Sons and Lovers, The Rainbow, and Women in Love. I had picked it up at some used bookstore. I read the back of the books. It looked interesting to me. Knew nothing about Lawrence. And the books just completely, gravitated to me. And over the years, I've read his short stories, many of them. And this is a nice edition here, the Everyman Library edition. But for me, one of his most arresting short stories is The Man Who Died, which is also in this collection here. And in this story, it's about Jesus Christ, who decides not to die on the cross. He's done being a teacher. He's not going to be anyone's savior. He wants to live as a man. So he leaves. He doesn't die on the cross. And he goes into Lebanon. Before he does so, though, he meets with, he calls her Madeline in the story, but it's supposed to be, I think, Mary Magdalene. And as we know from what may or may not have happened, Magdalene maybe loved Christ, and Christ maybe loved Mary Magdalene. I think in some of the Gnostic Gospels they go into more detail about that, but certainly not in the standard King James Bible. However, I always found it curious that after Christ died, he did appear to Mary. It was the first person he appeared to. Not to his mother, not to anybody else. The first person he chose to was Magdalene. But that's probably for another video. In any event, he has a conversation with Magdalene, here again called Madeline, here in the story by Lawrence. Is that he tells her, he says, Mary, you took more than you gave when it came to a relationship with her lovers. And in the sense of Christ, I gave more than I took. And it's an interesting scene between them. And he leaves, and he goes into Lebanon. And in Lebanon, he meets a priestess of Isis, who sees him as Osiris. And she's bewitched by him, and has a relationship with him, a carnal relationship with him. And I think I remember from the story, she ends up being pregnant by him towards the end. At least it seemed that way to me, as I remember the story. And again, I was thinking about this one, I was thinking about Bowes. So it's been a while since I read this one, but it's just been on my mind. It has been for years. It's a very human story by Lawrence. I mean, they all are. But it's a very human story about Christ, right? But before I had read this story by Christ, The Man Who Died by Lawrence, though, I had read The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, a controversial book. as we all know. And the film by Scorsese was even more controversial, it seemed to me, as I remember from when it premiered. And in the book, which is not in the film, of The Last Temptation of Christ, it's much the scene between Magdalene and Christ is much more. It's developed more. And Christ goes to visit Magdalene at her brothel. She's made love to dozens of men. And when he enters the room, she doesn't know that he's in there. And he sees her naked body there with bite marks and sweat and the results of making love to all these men, right? And when she sees him, she's infuriated. She covers herself and everything. But it's a beautiful scene in the book. It's a very painful scene, The Last Temptation of Christ, because I remember when I read this, again, I'd seen the film with a beautiful soundtrack by Peter Gabriel, and I decided to read the book. And it was this scene that just arrested me between Magdalene and Christ. She's really angry with them, and she says, you've chosen your path. You want to go and save the world, save humanity. Because basically she's in love with him, and she believes he's in love with her. And she's been making love to all these men to get back at him. And Christ is torn by this because he feels responsible. And there's a wonderful scene in the book where she remembers when they were both children. She was 4, he was 3. And she was able to climb some steps. And she would sit on top of the steps, and Christ would struggle. He would fall from one step and go back, but he wouldn't give up. But she would not give him a hand. She just waited for him to come to her. Again, you humanize Christ. You humanized all these people in this book by Kazantzakis, and like Lawrence did in The Man Who Died. In the 80s, there was a film by Godard called Hail Mary, which takes place in Paris, which is a retelling of the virgin birth. You have a teenage girl in Paris, who's going to give birth to Christ. It's a wonderful film by Godard, who's known for Breathless and other New Wave films from the 60s. And I rewatched this film earlier this year, and when I was thinking about The Last Temptation of Christ. But anyway, back to Lawrence. Lawrence has written excellent short stories, and he's first rate. And he's maybe one of my top 10 favorite short story writers, along with Bowles. But again, the name of the story is The Man Who Died. And you can find it just about anywhere when we get to books by Lawrence. But these are wonderful short storytellers, and ones that I think are just important. At least they're important, very important to me. I enjoy what they say about us. I enjoy how they write. They have beautiful images, beautiful sentences, and they really get to the heart of who we are. And I don't mind being unsettled. I don't mind being showed a mirror of who we are. That's what makes life really worth it all, really. I don't want illusions about things. I can come up with my own illusions of how things should be or things should not be. But I'm making that up. It doesn't make me feel any better because I know I'm lying to myself. I like the truth. I want you to get to the heart of the matter, to paraphrase and reference Graham Greene, another writer close to me. Thank you for viewing, and happy Sunday.